All right, today we're going to go over some updates I made to my filter calc tool to tie it together with the updates made in Betaflight 4.1 in regard to adding the RPM filters and also the filter sliders for the low pass filters. So as introduced with my RPM filter video, we talked about how to enable the RPM filters in Betaflight 4.1, make some tweaks to the dynamic notch to kind of offset the latency of the RPM notches, and then just use the filter sliders here to slide these up together to reduce your filtering. And we're doing that so you can reduce the latency, the amount of delay that the filters add to the gyro signal. As it's trying to smooth it out, it kind of delays it. So hopefully it's a pretty simple process now in Betaflight 4.1 from a user perspective. You're either using black box logs, or you're using just flight feel or motor heat as your guide for moving these sliders after you make these two adjustments. So if you've never seen this before, I've developed this filter calc tool a couple years ago. I think it's about 2 years ago now, that has all the Betaflight filters in it, and it shows how the attenuation is for each of the filters, and it also shows the delay that each of the filters adds. So this is from 0 to 600 hertz here, it looks like, and up here it's from 0 to 1000 hertz. This is each filter's delay, and the colors up here correspond to the colors down here. So if you're looking for the gyro signal one, that's this. The purple one is the low pass 2, so on and so forth. And you can see the delay of each filter, and then over here you can see the overall delay. This is the delay you're getting from the gyro filtering, and this is the delay you're getting for the D-term filtering, so if you add that both together. Over on this side is the attenuation of each filter. So this is how much it's reducing the noise. 1 is not reducing it at all, so if we zoom in here a little bit, you can see the top of the scale is 1. The bottom of the scale is 0, so 0 means it's not letting any noise through whatsoever. 1, it's letting all the noise through, so it's like a multiplier. And again, you can look at the colors here in the legend and correspond that to each filter, and then this red dashed line is the overall filtering that you have. So with this, made some updates to add in the filter sliders, so now you can move these sliders around and it will move the cutoff values in regard to low pass 1 and low pass 2, just like it does in Betaflight. And same thing for the D term low pass 1 and low pass 2 with the D term multiplier filter down here. You can just click on it, drag it around, or click these pluses and minuses here. You can simulate what throttle value you're interested in. When I typically am looking at filters and just planning out some options, I will generally run around 40–50% throttle right here just for analytical purposes. What I mostly see that I'm really trying to minimize phase delay for is if I'm working on prop wash. And prop wash generally starts around 40–70%. That's, you can't be at 0 throttle because then your props aren't really pushing air, so there's no wash. They're not trying to push against something to come out of a turn or things of that nature. So you have to be pushing some air, and just looking at my logs and other people's logs, right around 40–50%, that's where you start to see prop wash start. So that's where you really want to be focusing on getting your delay as low as you can. Obviously, as the throttle goes higher, the delay goes down lower and lower. So kind of that's the baseline where you want to be. So what we have here when you open the sheet is the default. So it would be at 1 and 1 for the filter multipliers. We'd have your default low passes set up here, your default dynamic notch, and the default is the RPM notches are turned off. So that's off by default. And if you go out here at 50% throttle, we'd be looking around 5.9 milliseconds of phase delay, that's a lot. So the defaults in Betaflight are very conservative. You're never going to get a optimized tune on this. However, we've tried to make them more performance gauge with 4.0, and it didn't work out well because a lot of different crafts are flown with Betaflight. Betaflight by far is the most widely used flight firmware out there compared to any of the others. So that variety really makes it difficult to have aggressive defaults. You have to almost have pretty conservative defaults. So that's 6 milliseconds of delay on the gyro signal at 50% throttle. Again, that's quite a bit. What we want to get, what I typically like to see there is about 4 milliseconds or less. That's my goal. It used to be between 4 and 5. Now I really want to see from 50% up in the 3s. That's competitive. If I can get there and everything still looks good I'm looking at black box logs so they don't look out of control, then that's I'm pretty satisfied with that. So if that tries to give you some sort of goal here, and that's overall phase delay over here, this red number. So let's see what the RPM filters do for turning those on. So we can just go into here and click on that. And we have the default Q and the harmonic set to 3. You can see the different notches here. So this is the first, the fundamental. This is the second harmonic, and then the third is way up here. So you can look in here and see the delay from each of the filters. Now you got to keep in mind there's 4 notches on each axis at each harmonic. So there's 4, 8, 12 total notches right here because there's 1 notch per each motor. So the delay per notch is really 0.1, but then there's 4 of them, so that's 0.4. Now this doesn't show, those 4 can be moving around to track each motor. We're not simulating the actual flight here. We're just using this as kind of like a planning tool. So I'm just taking the 0.1, multiplying it by 4 to get the 0.4. Same thing for the phase delay. So you have each of your harmonics. If you go here and you turn down your harmonics, and you can see how that makes an adjustment. So going from 3 to 2 harmonics only really saved 0.1 millisecond of phase delay, which is really not much. And that's, Chris Thompson will say, and a lot of people will say, turning down your harmonics doesn't save a lot. I talked about in my RPM video about turning it for either 1 or 2. There's definitely a point that just leaving it at 3 doesn't really hurt anything. So I really recommend not going below 2 harmonics on your RPM filters. And honestly, if you're not getting into the nitty gritty, I would just leave it at 3. Just leave the defaults alone. So let's talk about why. So if I have it at 3 harmonics, and you can see how these notches look here. This is the fundamental. This is the first set of notch filters, and it looks wider than the dynamic notches over here because there's 4 stacked right on top of each other. So in reality, they're not all lined up perfectly like that, but you can get the gist that there's 4 notches running around in this area, depending on what you're doing in flight, that are crushing out noise. So it's going to give you a pretty high attenuation right where all those motor peaks are. And that's why the RPM notches are so good. If I go down to 3, I say 0.1 milliseconds, which is really nothing. And it just pulls off this filter up at the top. I don't think that really helps or hurts anything. But if I change this from 2 to 1, there's a big difference that occurs in here. This notch over here will turn off. And when I start to turn down some of these other filters, you'll see that the overall filtering for this area goes way down because we don't have that second harmonic turned on. So let's get these filters more aggressive, and we can look at turning that on and off, and you can see why you probably want to leave at least 2 harmonics turned on, and honestly, probably just leave all 3, it's fine. The next thing we talked about in the RPM video is to change the Q for the dynamic notch, and then to change the offset, which is the offset between these 2 notches that the dynamic notch is controlling. Really, it's 2 notches as a Betaflight 4.0 and up, and they kind of shoulder the noise. Since we couldn't be targeting exactly on the peaks with the dynamic notch because it's always a little lagged, we made it into 2 notches, and you control it by the width. So with this tool, you can see in the width percentage, you can make it 20 and see how it makes the notches wider. And then you can make it 0, and you can see how it will make the notches just down to a single. So 0 in here, just like in Betaflight, will, instead of 2 notches that are around the dynamic notch, you're just going to have the 1. Now resetting here for a second, in the RPM notch video, I talked about how these tweaks to the dynamic notch offset the latency. So resetting this back and turning the RPM filters off, turning the dynamic notch back to its defaults, you can see on the gyro, we have about 3 milliseconds of phase delay. Now turning on the RPM notches and then making the adjustments to the dynamic notch that we talked about, you can see we also have 3 milliseconds of phase delay. So in that video, I expressed how the tweaks to the dynamic notch were necessary to offset the added phase delay of the RPM notches coming into play, and you can see that right there in the math and how we came to that conclusion. So what's the gain? Why are we doing this if we have the same phase delay? Well, you'll see the attenuation of noise is so much better. You can look here how much wider these RPM notches are, and also we're adding in this concept of the second harmonic to kill out noise up here. So you should be able to see it in flight. You should be able to see it in motor temperatures, and you can definitely see it in black box logs. So the concept of this drop down here is that now we're not going to necessarily have the dynamic notch tracking the motor peaks anymore. So we're going to set this to custom, and then we can just punch in whatever frequency we want the dynamic notch to be at. The direction you're seeing the filtering going across the sheet here is the order of how the filters are processed, which generally doesn't matter because it's like adding numbers together. It doesn't matter if you add, 2 plus 5 plus 8, you get to the same answer as 8 plus 5 plus 2 or 2 plus 8 plus 5. It doesn't really matter how you add them together. You're going to get the same result. However, it does matter for the dynamic notch peak detection. In Betaflight 4.0, the peak detection was moved to be after all the filters. So you'll see that here. The RPM notches occur first, then the low pass filters are applied, and then the dynamic notch peak detection algorithm goes into play, and it finds whatever peaks are left over and then centers the dynamic notch on top of that. The dynamic notch in that case guaranteed will not be at the same location as the RPM notches, because you can see how notch filters, they crush the noise at the center to 0, all the way to 0. Notice how the low pass filters do not do that. They never ever get to 0. Notch filters are unique. That's why there's so much focus on notch filters. It's just, they're the right tool for the job for killing out peak noise. So this dynamic notch is going to bounce around and clean up noise. You can play with having it on or off. Some guys on pretty clean builds do turn their dynamic notch off. So they'll just have the RPM notches, the gyro low passes, and that's it. I personally wouldn't do that. The notch filter is more effective than low pass filters, you can see, and it will target peaks. So if you bend a prop or hit a twig or something like that, the RPM and a peak starts to develop that the RPM notches aren't getting, the dynamic notch will go find that, jump on it. So it's a little bit of insurance there. I would focus more of my energy on getting these low pass filters moved up. And why is that? Well, look over here at the phase delay. This brown line here is the delay of the dynamic notch. And then these low pass filters, you can see this is the D-term low pass filtering and the gyro low pass filters here as well. Well, you can see those have more phase delay. So, it's the 80-20 rule. You don't want to spend 80% of your time on only 20% of the problem. The dynamic notch is not the big phase delay issue. It's these low pass filters we need to try to reduce as much as we can. So I would try to move these up. Now, the biggest offenders you can see on phase delay here are the D-term low pass filters, but the D-term is the sole root of the problem when it comes to vibrations in the PID loop. It's the P and I term really aren't impacted that much to vibrations. It's the D term that's really the issue. So you inherently are going to have more filtering on the D term. So don't let that throw you off, but just the concept that the low pass filters are where you want to focus your energy. So in Betaflight 4.1, the offset differential between the defaults, where you can see their low passes are starting at 200 to 500 versus the D term is 70 to 170, that's kind of built in. So from here, you're just moving these sliders up. So you can see after doing some flights and moving those sliders up, what you can kind of get to. This would be sliders at the 2.0 multiplier. So it's basically taking the defaults, multiplying it by 2.0 in these values here, and that it's putting into the low pass filters. And then ultimately we're getting over here at our phase delay at 50% throttle is 3.8. So that's pretty good. And then that's at 50% throttle. So that's, in general, at 50% throttle to have 3.8 milliseconds of phase delay total, if everything else is looking good, that's pretty good, because you got to keep in mind as I go up to 60% throttle, that's where you're really into the prop wash and it's really pushing. Now you're at 3.6. 70%, you're still probably in prop wash area, 3.5, so you're looking pretty good. So if you did run that and everything's running good and you just, some of this hobby is just experimenting. So I know a lot of guys in the hobby really just enjoy experimenting with things. So if you're one of them, like myself, and really want to push things a little bit more and, incorporate that into your daily flying, some things you could do from here to get phase delay even less. One of the things is just bumping up the Q values even further. So some of the people that are running the RPM notches are running at a Q factor of 1,000 versus 500. And you can see if we take the Q factor here and change that to 1,000, that goes from 0.6 milliseconds of total phase delay to 0.3. So it halves the phase delay from the RPM filters. So that's pretty good. I'm shaving some off there. Same thing with the dynamic notch. You could move this up some. I probably wouldn't. Again, these are some little things. I've seen a couple questions and comments on what is the Q? What is this Q factor? Nobody explains what the Q factor is. Well, the Q factor is literally a value that's in the equation for the filtering. It's the quality factor on the filtering, and it directly ties in. It's how the filtering works. So just think of it as a variable. What's interesting with filters and the Q factors is with notch filters, as the center of the notch goes higher in the frequency spectrum and moves up, the notch gets wider if you're holding the same Q. So as the filters are moving higher, they actually get more effective. The phase delay goes down, but the attenuation goes up. It's really kind of exactly what we want to happen. We want the notch to get wider because the phase delay is going down, so we don't need it to be so narrow. And just by holding a constant Q as a variable, then that just inherently happens with how the math works. So again, that Q factor you're adjusting a variable directly in the equation of the filters themselves. Now, if you do happen to come across any text on filtering, when you're looking at our Q factors, they're multiplied by 100. So when we're really talking about a Q of 250, that's really a Q in the equation of 2.5. 1000's really a Q of 10, so on and so forth. Another thing you could look at is upping the Q on the dynamic notch, but I wouldn't get too drastic with that. The dynamic notch, since it's not following motor signals in a nice fluid fashion, it's kind of jumping around a lot. And when you get higher Q factors, anything above 250, anything above, like, it starts from 250 to 500, and then it really gets crazy above 500. You get these things called transients, where the filter repositioning itself with such a high Q factor can actually generate noise into the signal. So be cautious with that. Do keep it in mind if you do bump up your Q of your RPM notches, but those are moving a lot smoother because they're following the motors, where the dynamic notch is kind of jumping around quite a bit, depending on any residual peak noises that it detects and tries to jump on top of. Final things you can try then, you can look at is just turning some of the filters off. So you have these gyro low passes 2s and the D-term low passes 2. I wouldn't recommend turning any of the D-term low pass filters off, low pass 1 or low pass 2. You're going to need those. If you would turn off low pass 2, these are both PT1 filters. So if you're going to turn off low pass 2 on the D-term, you're really going to need to set D-term low pass 1 to biquad or vice versa, because you're going to need that high frequency attenuation strength there based on some of my experiences. But low pass 1 and 2, those you could definitely give a shot at turning off. You can see right there we have half a millisecond of phase delay right there. So even before maybe turning the Q up, maybe explore turning off these low passes. And if you recall my Betaflight 4.0 filter strategy, we were doing that without the RPM notch filters. We were doing it just with the dynamic notch. We were turning off all the gyro low pass filters and just running a D-term low pass filters. Having two PT1 filters cascaded with each other is kind of the same thing as a biquad. It just gives it a little bit more flexibility. And we found that PT1 low pass filters are a little bit more resilient to lower frequency noise and maybe not have as much step response issues as it's getting moved around and things of that nature. So I would just look at turning off your low pass 1 and low pass 2 and see how it goes for you. And again, this is only if you really wanted to experiment with it and play around a little bit. But if we turn these off, and then let's just say we do keep these at 500 for the RPM notches, you can see we will get some pretty compelling phase delay. So now at 50% throttle, we're at 3.3 milliseconds. I think before we were at 3.8, 3.9. So, you know, it's not drastically less, but as you go up in throttle value, you can see at 70%, you're going to be at a 3.0. So you do get to this spot where between 3 and 4 milliseconds of phase delay, you really start to get to a diminishing return where you're not going to be able to kind of cross this barrier. It's like trying to approach the speed of light, or trying to, you know, to take your grade in school from a D to a B. Yeah, you do a little bit more studying. It's not that hard, but you know, if you got a 95 on a test, to get 100, it's a lot more difficult because you can only get like 1 or 2 questions wrong and you're not going to get 100. So you get to this spot where it's a diminishing return with turning off filters. I think with the Betaflight 4.1 process of turning on the RPM filters, adjusting the dynamic notch, and then using the sliders, if you can get those all the way up top, you are 90% of the way to the ideal filter setup. If you wanted to push the envelope a little further, I would look at turning off the gyro filters, but you can see you're not going to get that much more savings. You might get half a millisecond more phase delay savings, and that's about it. Is it worth it to you? Well, it's up to you to decide and play around with. That's half the fun of some of the hobby stuff. So in closing, these are the settings we were talking about for trying to get to the 90% optimal filter setup. Would be, if you can, the first part is getting your quad set up for the RTM filters. I would probably just leave it at 3, getting your dynamic notch set to low, width of 0, getting the Q set to 250, and then starting to move the sliders up and, kind of flight by flight, one couple steps at a time, and see how it goes. You could get to a spot, if you're not looking at logs, you could get to a spot where your motors aren't any warmer up in this range, but your prop wash performance isn't better. Maybe you even think it could get worse. That is possible, because you can cross this threshold where your noise to signal ratio is too high, so you have too much noise in your D-term signal, so it becomes kind of less effective at commanding the motors. And whether your motors get hot with that or not really depends on the motor. What's the material? What is it? Aluminum? Is it steel? How's air flowing through it? Things of that nature. So the hot motors thing is a general guide, but it doesn't obviously tell you the amount of information you can see in a black box log. But if you're not into logging, definitely checking your motor temps is one way to get somewhat of a gauge, and then just doing prop wash runs and kind of trial and error. To me, that's the gap between logging and not logging. If you're not using black box logs, you're using flight and trial and error a lot more versus just going right to the logs and kind of directly seeing what you got and seeing how, when you're making adjustments, how that's affecting kind of under the hood performance of the quad directly. Okay, everybody. Well, that's it. You can download the Filter Calc tool at tiny.cc/UAVtech. It runs on Excel. I'm going to try to make a light version that you can pull up in Google Docs. Probably won't have the graphs, though. So if you don't have Excel, it might be a little tough, but I get Excel. That's what it generated, and it's honestly, it's quite a complex graph, and I can't make it into other versions too easily. So hopefully this helps. Look for the light version out there as well. See if that works. And thanks again, and I'll see you in the next one.